That's right. So we need that reference point.
So stage 2 is the integration of stage 1, in effect.
That's right. It's the integration
into our daily life.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
The assimilation, the embodiment of that. So rather than just being a momentary experience of the awakened state of mind, we begin to integrate that enlightenment into our life so we're living it. But that takes two things. The feminine is surrender and the masculine is actually submission. We actually submit ourselves to life, and in my case, to a teacher and to a training called Zen practice, right? And I did that until my teacher died, which was about 24 years, until 1995. However, there's a point of completion where not that we've stopped submitting and we stopped surrendering, but there's a point where we're complete in that process that we actually move to stage 3. And we actually, that's again a sudden experience of the impersonal. Stage 2 is very personal. It's a personal relationship with life, with the world, with the teacher, the teaching.
Isn't it?
It's very practical.
Yes. Yeah.
That's right. And it's, again, dualistic. Yes. You're coming from the non-dual and back into the dualistic world, in the dualistic realm. Stage 3 is a bigger, more complete experience of what stage 1 was, where it's, we call it a complete opening, a complete awakening. It's not final, but it's complete.
Now, what does complete opening, complete awakening mean?
You can never go back. In other words, stage 1 is like the opening of a shutter of a lens. It opens momentarily and it closes, even if it stays open for a long time, like mine stayed kind of open for over a year. It's still momentary in the sense that it's within time and space. You're coming from the absolute, you're coming from the relative, and you're experiencing the absolute, the dimension of the absolute. That's stage 1. Stage 2, you're coming from that experience of the absolute, and you're moving back into the relative world. Okay? In relation to a teaching, to a teacher, to a process, to a practice. Stage 3, you finally become the master. Okay? So what happens at stage 3 is you eliminate all doubt to who you are and what this life is.
So the realization, let's say, of oneness is there permanently.
That's right.
But you still have details to tidy up in a way.
Lots.
And what kind of details?
Well, a lot of shadows. A lot of shadows. Because what happens at stage 3 is that at stage 3, there is no duality, so there's no cause and effect, therefore there's no karma. So one of the things that can happen at stage 3 is ignoring the law of causation. Because at stage 3, everything is perfect as it is, and one sees every manifestation as absolutely perfect. So like every snowflake falls exactly in the right spot. Every leaf in fall falls exactly in the right spot. Then we have to shovel the snow or rake the leaves, but they fall in exactly the right spot. In other words, all manifestations are perfect. So there's no sense in here of big heart. There is a big heart, but there's no sense that anybody has to be liberated, in a sense, from anything, because it's all perfect.
Okay, now I'm going to bring something in here which is, I wouldn't say it's a process for me, but it's certainly a series of questions for me. And we've had a lot of interviews on the subject of non-duality in Conscious TV, and there've been fascinating interviews. And one of the, not with everybody, but one of the consistent themes that comes up is that once the Great Awakening happens, there's no self, meaning there's no personality, meaning there's no one to do anything about anything. And so
that becomes the shadow. That's absolutely true, and that becomes the shadow.
So explain more
about
that.
Yeah, I will. Okay, so the experience is there is no self, there is no ego, there is no me.
And that's a genuine experience.
It's an absolutely genuine, authentic experience, and we get stuck there. So traditionally in Zen we talk about that as being stuck in the absolute, or the stink of enlightenment.
But if there's no self, then who gets stuck there?
Because there is a self.
So you're saying there is a self?
There is a self, okay, but the self has expanded beyond itself, right? And there's no boundary, there's no limit at this point. So the shadow of this experience of no self is the no self. In other words, that there still is a self, because there wouldn't be a stage 4 or stage 5 if there wasn't. So what happens is now the self comes in a covert way as a disowned voice. The experience is there's no self. But then what happens is the ego then takes that experience, owns that experience, and walks around, I have no ego, I have no self.
That's right.
And that becomes the shadow.
Okay.
That's why stage 4 is so important and so difficult, because no one is going to go to stage 4, because stage 4 is returning to embrace the self. It's returning to the dual and to the personal. In other words, the self comes back. Okay? No one's going to do that in their right mind once they reach complete liberation. That becomes an accumulation of karma, and then at some point I call the stage 4, I call stage 3 the great enlightenment, okay?
Right.
Or drop off body mind, great liberation.
Right.
Stage 4 I call falling from grace.
Right.
Because it's like Humpty Dumpty sitting on a wall, and all of a sudden Humpty Dumpty does a face plant.
Yeah.
Does a face plant, right into the pavement, and shatters. And at that point, all the stuff that has been suppressed, in other words, all the human aspects, all the dualistic things, come back. So now there's once again a self that gets angry, that gets frightened, that has this, has that. And who's going to want that if you've been in nirvana?
No, but you see, and I'm not going to generalize. I have to generalize. I'm not going to be specific here. Some of the people do say they still get angry, they still have fear. They're not denying that exists, but they're just saying there's no one in control of that.
Well, that's true. That's true. I mean, as long as they're not denying that they get angry or they have fear, then they're not in denial.
They're giving it permission. In effect, they're saying it's what's happening. There's no self here to have control over it. They just let it happen, or it just happens.
There is no self there, okay? And there is. So again, let's use the triangle I was trying to create with the dual and the non-dual and the apex. So you've got self, and you have no self. So I spent about 24 years in this no self place. Now I would say to embrace both the self and no self, and to come from that transcendent place where you include and go beyond. So in other words, there's a self, but it's not such a solid self. It's not a permanent self. It's just what the Buddha said. The self is not solid, it's not permanent, it's not real, right? But there is a self. He never denied that there was a self. But it's not we're not as fixated on it, we're not as driven by it, we're not as obsessed with ourself anymore. It becomes a much greater picture.
And where does the motivation come from to help that process?
Well, for me, the apex is big heart. I call the book Big Mind, Big Heart.
Yes.
So big mind is over here, the transcendent, and big heart, great compassion, is the apex. Because big mind is basically not an active thing. It's a process of awareness and consciousness. It's beingness. Big heart is actually then coming back into the body and eventually returning to the marketplace, right? And for me, return to the marketplace doesn't mean just going back into the city and working. It means coming back to the market means owning all the disowned aspects that we have disowned when we became spiritual. Like when we become spiritual, obviously we pursue loving and compassion more than we do hatred and bigotry. We disown all these things that we consider not spiritual, right?
Yeah.
We try to be more compassionate, more loving, more kind, more considerate, more generous, more open, and we disown all the opposites.